president's choice for ambassador to the EU. He's just flown back overnight from Washington, and by James Rubin, a Democrat who served in the Clinton administration. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with that last point that I made there in the voiceover. We now have a Eurosceptic in the Oval Office. He's very pro-Brexit. He's not keen on further European Union integration. What are the implications of that?
Well, I think the implications are, first of all, a renewal of the US-UK special relationship. So you see the Prime Minister going already on a very fast trip to build and rebuild this relationship. Already, the bust of Winston Churchill is back in the Oval Office. It didn't even take her arrival to make that happen. Interestingly, though, Martin Luther King's bust is also there. So there's an act of unity even in his first movement of busts into that office. But I think that the significance is that Donald Trump will be oriented towards bilateral relationships and not multilateral or supernatural.
For 50 years, it's been the policy of the State Department to encourage European integration. The White House now has a man who doesn't believe in it. What are the implications of that?
Well, I think we're present at the abdication, the unraveling of America's leadership of the West. There was a thing called the West that America has led since the end of World War II, creating, I think we just heard supernatural. I think you meant supernational, although for some people supernatural is probably what it is. We created these institutions. We believed that they were valuable. I think with American leadership, the world was at peace in Europe, and the world grew increasingly democratic and increasingly prosperous. These things worked. Wars were averted, which could be extremely costly. But when something works in diplomacy, you don't really understand what the consequences could have been. And I think we've gotten complacent, and I think the new president is taking advantage of that, and I think it's a terrible tragedy that so many in the West take for granted the successful leadership and institutions that we've built.
You could argue, indeed Jamie Rubin has argued in some articles, that Mr. Obama began this process of America withdrawing somewhat from leadership of the West. Will Mr. Trump's America be more involved in the world? Will it provide that leadership, or will it continue the process with the running shoes on that began with Mr. Obama?
No, I think that it is clear that President Obama stepped back from American leadership. He withdrew from the world. He had a horrendous 8 years in office, and American power has been diminished everywhere, not just in Europe, but everywhere in the world. So that power will be reasserted in a sense. Trump takes power. The focus will be on America first, but America has strong interests around the world.
How does it reassert itself for the rest of the world?
Well, I think that the institutions will be recreated. Some of them may be taken down, and there may be some new ones. I think NATO itself, and certainly the defense secretary will have discussions with Donald Trump about how NATO can be reformed and reshaped, and maybe there'll be more burden sharing. That's an important thing for Mr. Trump.
You are tipped to be the US ambassador to Brussels, to the EU, and we're still waiting to hear if that's going to happen. I understand it is. But is it true to say that Mr. Trump does not believe in EU integration?
I think he made that clear in the Michael Gove speech. He's not in favor of supranational, although he mentioned God 3 times in his inaugural address. He does not believe in those kinds of organizations. So he's investing himself in bilateral relationships, the first and foremost of which will be with the United Kingdom.
So here we have a president that doesn't believe in EU integration, and has been highly critical of NATO. Do the people he's appointed to defense, Secretary of State, National Security, do you think that will temper this anti-NATO rhetoric? Will he come round to a more pro-NATO situation?
Well, I think we're going to end up, those of us who care about America's leadership in the world, missing President Obama a lot. And that's because rhetoric matters when you're the leader of the West. Yes, I think you're right. The Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense will limit the damage. They will probably urge him not to take formal steps to unravel this most powerful and most successful alliance in history, the NATO alliance. But the damage is already being done. When you're the leader of the West, when you're a leader, leadership means that you are persuading, you are encouraging, you are bolstering your leadership and these institutions by the way you speak. And millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions of people have now heard the United States say, what we care about is within our borders, and the rest of you can fend for yourselves.
What do you say to that?
Well, it's such an overstatement from a Clintonian. The point is that Donald Trump is in the Jacksonian tradition of national populism. So he's appealing to the American population. He's putting the people first. If anything, the other day, and I was sitting right below the dais during the inaugural address, he basically said, everyone sitting behind me is part of the problem. Everyone sitting in front of me, the crowd and the crowd on television, is part of the solution. So we're giving the government back to the people, and that emphasis is really going to change American life, including American international relations. It doesn't mean we're moving out of NATO. It doesn't mean that we're giving up any of the seats of power we have or all the treaties will be torn up. It simply means we're going to put our interests, our national interests, first.
Indeed, there are echoes in his inauguration address of Andrew Jackson's inauguration address in 1820, though that night the Jacksonians went on and had a party and trashed the White House, but Mr. Trump's people didn't do that. So there is a difference there. He also said something else in the inauguration address, that protectionism would lead to prosperity. I would suggest there is no evidence of that from the post-war world, that is not true.
Well, he didn't mention protectionism. He did talk about protecting the American worker, protecting the American jobs, protecting the American economy. I actually think that Donald Trump will not turn out to be a kind of Smoot-Hawley protectionist. If you read The Art of the Deal, which I've suggested...
This referring to the two Republican senators who introduced massive tariffs in the Hoover administration.
Correct. So I'm not looking forward to that. I don't think you'll see that. But I said to number 10 this last week, if you read The Art of the Deal, you'll understand how Donald Trump, actually on a transactional basis, deals with people and will deal with countries. So there's a lot of bluster, there's a lot of positioning, and I think you see this already in his jawboning of jobs back to the United States. The Chinese are afraid because things are going to change.
Respond to that, but also deal with this proposition. China's the biggest loser of this election result.
Well, let me say this. The first time in American history, an American president has set forth, certainly in modern history, his view of the world, and it is a mercantilistic view of the world. It is through who makes more money, who gets more trade. It doesn't look at the shared values, the leadership, the defense that the world needs. The Art of the Deal has no application to America's leadership of the world. That's what we're learning. You can be a great businessman and make great real estate deals. Whether he did or not is debatable, but it has nothing to do with inspiring shared values from the West. Now, you're saying that China may lose because he may pressure them to reduce their trade deficit with the United States, their trade. They may or they may not. We may both lose. Right now, his Secretary of State has said, and I think he's going to walk this back once he's briefed, has said that they're going to prevent the Chinese from entering these islands in the South China Sea. If they were to do that, it would be a blockade, and there would be a shooting war between the United States and China. So U.S.-China relations are the most important bilateral relationship of the United States, and they don't lend themselves to the bluff and bluster that may have worked when you're trying to get a big building on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan.
Is China the biggest loser?
I think that the Chinese have a lot to lose. And Mr. Xi was at Davos this last week to compare and contrast him with President Trump's inauguration, defending his role in the global economy. And China has largely been a beneficiary of this very free trade-oriented regime, and some of that is going to be reeled back.
Is Germany the second biggest loser? In the sense that I understand that he hasn't even agreed a time to see Angela Merkel yet, but also that those close to him believe that Germany is guilty of currency manipulation by adopting a weak euro instead of the strong Deutschmark, and that is why they're running a huge balance of payments surplus with the United States. American-German relations may not be great.
Well, there is this point of view throughout Europe. You only need to go and talk to the Southern Europeans about this question. It seems like the euro has been basically aligned to benefit Germany. Joe Stiglitz, the famous, actually left of center Democrat economist, has made the same case in a recent book. So the point about the euro is one to take seriously on both sides of the aisle. And in this case, I think Germany will be put under the spotlight.
Angela Merkel has shown herself to be the most respected and the most successful leader in Europe. We who care about the West, who care about the shared values of the West, should pray and hope that she is reelected. This isn't about dollars and cents. We are living in a time where the Russian leader has invaded another country in Europe. And for some inexplicable reason, the American president, who can use his insult diplomacy on everyone, including Mrs. Merkel, the only person he can't seem to manage to find anything to criticize about is Mr. Putin. There are things more important than the actual details of your currency. There are things like preventing another war in Europe, preventing a war between the Chinese and the United States. You talk about the Trident missile you were talking about all morning. Well, nuclear deterrence is extremely important. Again, it doesn't lend itself to the bluff and bluster of a real estate deal.
I understand all that, but the fact we're even talking about these things shows you the new world that we're moving into. And just to get you both to react to this, this is a man that ended the Bush dynasty. It's a man that beat the Clinton machine. It's a man in his inauguration that not only did he not reach out to the Democrats, he didn't even mention the Republicans. These are change days for us.
Well, they are change days, and change can be good or it can be disastrous. And what I'm worried about is it's easy in the world of diplomacy and in the leadership of the United States to break things, to break relationships, to ruin alliances. These are things that were carefully nurtured. George Shultz, the famous Republican Secretary of State,
under Mr. Reagan,
talked about diplomacy as gardening, the slow, careful creation of a place with blossoming bilateral relationships and flowering multilateral relationships that takes decades to create.
So
Donald Trump would throw them away in a matter of days.
I'll give you the final word.
I worked for George Shultz, so let me tell you that George Shultz was a Marine who stood up for America, who defended America, who would actually be in favor of many of the things that Donald Trump and the Trump administration
I would give him a call, because you'll find out that all his top aides that I've spoken to are appalled by Mr. Trump's abdication of leadership.
He's going to eradicate radical Islam terrorists from the earth. Is there a plan to do that?
I think that the Defense Department is in fact tasked now to come up with that plan. And I know that people in the national security realm have been working on that plan. They say they will have such a plan in some detail within 60 to 90 days.
Right, we shall.
Let's hope they succeed.
Very well. We've run out of time, but fascinating issues. I thank you both. So, to